Just going to mute myself.
So we are broadcasting. It'll just take a couple of seconds to catch up with itself.
Cool. So are we live now? Sorry, I'm going to do that typical thing where it's like you shouldn't start the YouTube broadcast by saying, "Are we live now?" But I've done it. So this is going to be a session that's all about admitting mistakes and challenges under lockdown, John. So this was just bound to happen.
We are now live, so all of that
hooray.
has been broadcasted.
Amazing. Well, hi everyone. Welcome once again, and welcome to people who are following us, following this discussion on YouTube live. So welcome to Queering Digital Space. This is an event that's part of a series of Social Arts Network London meetups that we're doing online, where in general within Social Art Meetup, it's an incredible mix of different people working around the intersection of art and social engagement. So you can be an artist, a poet, creative practitioner, writer. The aim here is to connect lots of different people working around lots of different types of practice and trying to understand how we navigate important social and political issues via art and creativity in general. So we've been starting this series of online meetups every third Wednesday of the month to try and engage more deeply with these issues, and really based around this question of what it means to be doing social engagement right now under lockdown in situations that are stressful, that are quite challenging, and that really push us to question lots of things about our practice and ourselves. So based on that, Queering Digital Space, this event, is really a way to bring that discussion concerning what it means to be looking at social engagement around queerness, queering space, when that space is being in many ways taken away from us at the moment. Under lockdown and due to pandemic, there's lots of different spaces, I mean, you know as well as I do, that have been shut down. There's been lots of spaces and events relating to Pride which have been cancelled, and it's been quite a challenge these past few months to try and that people who are most vulnerable and isolated within this community do not completely lose that sense of community that you can sometimes only find within those queer spaces. And I say queer spaces in a way which is completely inclusive. I think at the moment, there's been lots of discussions online about exclusion and gatekeeping, and lots of people engaging in exclusionary behavior. I think the importance of a queer space is making sure that it's a space where everybody can explore and come to terms with their own identity in different ways. I think that's also something that we want to bring to the table here. So for this session, I decided that it would be interesting to have it as more of a kind of free discussion around, maybe a discussion that we would have had around in other times around a bar table outside in the pouring rain, because it's the UK, about how we're feeling right now in terms of queering space, what we kind of want to bring to the table, what we want to revolutionize, and how we want to maintain community and enact change. So we're going to be hearing from amazing range of speakers today. But before that, I wanted to remind people just now following us on YouTube about the way you can engage with this discussion. So we've got chat where you can ask questions for our speakers. And after we've had a presentation from our speakers, we're going to have more of a moderated discussion where you'll be able, where Sally will be able to take your questions and read them out so that we can kind of have a bit of an exchange. And Sally will be posting the Safer Spaces Agreement in the YouTube chat as well, which is a really nice kind of good way of reminding you of general guidelines in engaging with this discussion. Like a bar, there's the kind of rules of engagement, and ways of making this a safe space for everyone. And if you're transphobic or homophobic in a queer bar, you get kicked out. And it's the same situation here, to be perfectly blunt. In our artist speak information, we will be putting people's pronouns. So also make sure that you do not accidentally misgender anyone when you're asking a question. But if you do so, we'll kind of remind you of the speaker's pronouns and correct them for you in that sense. So great, everybody's on the same page. That's great. And we can begin with the exciting stuff. So I'm going to let the speakers take over for now, and just present you a little bit and give you a little bit of insight on what everybody's going to be talking about. So we've got the amazing Tony D. Paul, who is an independent artist based in Manchester. They've got so many amazing kind of things that they're working on, but Tony D works as a writer, a workshop leader, a collaborator. Their current practice is composed of performances and installations that take place in cemeteries, refugee centres, churches, theatres, exploring otherness linked to race, disability and queerness. And we first met in a cemetery, so that's actually really, really timely to mention cemeteries in that context. Myla Kovide is a poet, actor, and brilliant museums and heritage professional who is also a games designer and an illustrator. So lots of different feathers in their hat as well. They're also the co-director of the Queer Heritage Forum, a collective of heritage professionals on the LGBTQI spectrum that was started under lockdown. And I recognize some Queer Heritage Forum contributors, so that will be really interesting to have them involved as well. That's also the case for Hannah Ayres, who is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at University of Warwick, looking at queer representation in museums and investigating how we kind of create and critique these representations. And Hannah is also part of the Queer Heritage Forum and has helped put together podcasts and events for the very first digital Pride that took place this year, as a kind of trying to find a digital alternative to creating community online around Pride. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you for now. Tony D, if you want to start?
Hi everyone, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm so sick of saying that sentence, can everyone hear me? Hello folks, I am Tony D, and like Claire just said and summarised so wonderfully, I am a performance artist, writer, maker, and I make stuff for places that is not always a theatre. I am someone who sort of engaged with performance art whilst I was at university, and I was like, oh, this is way more interesting than like going and watching Shakespeare for 400 hours. And there seemed to be better representation of people who looked like me and were exploring things that I was interested in. And they were making work for the back of pubs and in sort of rundown working men's pubs and cemeteries, hairdressers, places that I sort of was really inspired by, that I realized that there was a broader way of making theatre or performance that wasn't confined by a traditional space. And I think it sort of ties really nicely into why I wanted to do this event, which was thinking about how I have or have not fit into traditional queer spaces and what it's meant to find community in other ways and start to challenge those institutions that pride themselves on being representative of queer, but that actually not being the case, because it was full of the same types of people and was missing massive gaps. I also identify as disabled and I'm neurodiverse. And I think a lot of the queer disabled community made their home online long before a pandemic. And it's been really interesting to see people who maybe have never engaged in questions around access before suddenly recognizing that the spaces that they believed were accessible for all queer people were not actually. So yeah, I think I sort of have spent a long time thinking about how things don't fit, and where we can sort of remold something and go, oh, we're not welcome over there, so we'll just build our own thing, and it'll probably be better and more inclusive than the thing that they've built over there. Yeah, so that's me. I think that's enough. Yeah, that's enough. I'll pass on.
I mean, I could listen to you all day, Tony. But we will have lots of chance to discuss a bit more later and kind of have a bit of a larger exchange. So thank you so much for that. Myla, if you wanted to talk a bit about your practice.
Sure. Yeah. First time introducing myself, so bear with me. So my main focus with queer activism is joining up queer heritage with heritage spaces through like digital interactions and like kind of engagement side of things. So like Claire said, it led me to things like designing a series of computer games, co-directing Queer Heritage Forum, acting, spoken word, and like everything that I could possibly get my hands into in some way. At the moment, it's like my biggest project is co-directing Queer Heritage Forum with Jack Shoulder and Danny Take-Reid, where we bi-weekly open forums for queer heritage folk, and recently we completed our first digital Pride event called QHF Pride 2020, and the theme was being together. For my heritage work specifically, other than QHF, I focus mainly on game creation. So we have 3 games planned underneath the heading Corvidae Games, which is, that's our name, yay. And it's focused more on like heritage and collections and like kind of like how that translate as a queer person, and how like queer people can just like be in those spaces without having to feel like they're othered or specialized, or like, you know, we have the one person who isn't, you know, like the token queer person. We don't need that. Anybody can be in heritage. Unfortunately, they're not predominantly white spaces, and I kind of want to be able to change that in some way through QHF and through just making games for fun. What else? So like kind of in my spare time leading up to the lockdown, I was doing a movie called The Yerdswine with the Pandora Men, which is a group of people who act for fun. And the movie is like a Scottish horror movie, but it's important to me because it's the first time that I was able to perform as a trans person on screen and like have that portrayed as a character, and people just like openly accept it without having to have those awkward conversations, which I love. Other things as well that I do, I illustrate, and I do illustrations for a magazine called Gwillian, which is a Welsh sci-fi magazine. The first one's coming out in September 1st, I believe. And the best part I like about the illustrations that I've made for them is they're all ever so slightly queer, and there's like that hidden story in every single illustration, and I love doing that. It's one of my favorite parts of drawing, is like having that extra meaning for people who, when they see it, they get it, and if you don't know about it, then you won't get it. And I think that's kind of like indicative towards digital spaces in general, in the sense that, you know, like we have that space because we're queer and we're on the internet already. However, it's a difference between going in with an intention and like changing the space around you and like the people and interactions that you have with people, and having that pointed change that you're like have in mind to make as well. And I really just want to promote that as much as possible and help as many people to make that happen for them as well. And as Tony said, like there's so many spaces like that we go to and we're just like, oh yeah, it's totally inclusive, people can come here. But then, you know, if you have disabilities or neurological problems, then you can't can't be in those spaces, and you really struggle with being there. And then like having the lockdown happen means that all those spaces went digital, and it was so much easier to facilitate and like be there, even though, you know, obviously from a digital perspective, if you don't have access like to internet and stuff, then it's harder for you. But for people who already had access to the internet and were disabled or have like who weren't neurotypical, it just became so much easier. And there was so much more you could do and engage with. And that's me.
Thanks so much. That's great. Are you saying that was the first time you kind of were presenting yourself in earnest, or? I mean, that was that was great. Hannah, do you want to talk next?
Yeah. I'm trying to like sort it out in my brain, so I'm just not all over the place. Because
it's fine. It's a queer bar space, you know. It's just things are floating in the air, and then different ideas come out.
That's basically how I talk. But yeah, I am a PhD student. I work in museums and queer representation in museums, which I was doing my field work, and you know, all of that got cancelled during the pandemic, and I was like, oh, what's happening? So I threw myself into work and doing stuff and doing way too much. Actually, in June I kind of burned out and then needed a week after and took a bit of time to myself. But I also run you know, as well as doing PhD stuff, I run a group which we were previously Queer History Warwick, but we're now Queer/Disrupt. And that kind of movement has come about from spending a lot more time online and changing kind of the remit of the group. Originally, we were a very, very academic group, and we've been trying to break out of that. But I think I don't know, one of the benefits of going online is the chance to create way more accessible work, because you know the people who are coming might not be, you know, university students that are coming to a specific room because they go to that specific uni, because we're based at the Uni of Warwick. But yeah, we did at the beginning, we did a couple of virtual talks, like a dragged through history talk from IB Profane, who also helped me run the group, Nick Cherryman. I did a talk on trans history, so trans history, trying to create an accessible trans history. And it was really fun to prepare for. We had like crisis in community and a spotlight on Section 28, and we're trying to, just because of the situation, we're going to continue doing all our events kind of online in the future. So we've got stuff coming up about early modern witchcraft and queerness in witchcraft, and it's exciting. There's lots of exciting stuff happening. But for the QHF Pride 2020, I decided I would do podcasts, and we had like a couple of weeks. So at the beginning of June, we decided to do this, and then I was like, yeah, let's do podcasts. I've never done podcasts before. That'd be well exciting. Let's do 3. Let's do 3 podcasts. Let's edit them all. Let's get all the guests in 3 weeks. And it was really stressful, but one of them, like, it's the most fun thing I've done. Like I was sitting there with everybody and having these conversations about, I don't know, it's stuff you wouldn't get to talk about with people otherwise. Like we did one on gaming and queer gaming, and I did that with my little brother who isn't queer. And just him doing kind of all this research was really nice, and he started to kind of understand where I was coming from a little bit, and we used it as a little bit of a bonding tool. And then we did a Queer Tunes one, which was super exciting, and then a grassroots versus corporate queerness, which is, yeah, I just love doing all of them. And yeah, I did a few blog posts here and there, did a few bits and pieces. The writing was really hard. I found like doing talks a little bit easier than trying to write stuff and get stuff. Oh, here's proper academic writing. No, that was not happening during the first few weeks. But yeah, we're trying with the group I help run. We're trying to branch out and do way more online stuff. So at the moment we're running a project called Queering the Quarantine. So we're asking for creative responses to kind of the COVID-19 crisis and from queer people within the UK. And we mainly did this because we felt we weren't, we brought a few more people into the group and we asked their opinion, and they said that actually we don't think you're going far enough. Like, it's still quite academic, it's still very text heavy. Like, where's the expression through movement? Where's the expression through dance? Like, you could do so much online and it's not being done. There's different opinions on TikTok, but the amount of creativity I see on it and people doing different things is, I find it quite exciting. But yeah, I think that's me. I'm going to stop rambling for right now.
I would say that rambling is highly encouraged, whether it's in questions, discussions in general. I think that when you ramble, you end up in a very different place than when you started, but you sometimes a more interesting place, so you kind of find new connections. So thank you so much, all three of you, for presenting that, and then we can kind of delve deeper in discussion. I guess I should say a little bit about myself, and also why I'm wearing a mustache, which I don't usually do, but sometimes I do when I kind of embody my drag king alter ego, Eugène de la Croissant, who's not making an appearance here today because I did contemplate whether you wanted to have a boisterous white straight man on this panel, and then I decided you maybe didn't want to, that maybe we need a break from the outside world. But my practice, I work as a freelance curator and educator, working with a lot of different museums and heritage sites to attempt to queer their collections and create new opportunities to engage around queer heritage with them. At the moment, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see that I'm basically doing a big nerd out on Shibson Hall, where Anne Lister, the first modern lesbian, which is a kind of a weird title, but essentially the first kind of a 19th century lesbian that we know of, and that kind of maybe would have identified as such, lived. So it's kind of going through what we know of Anne Lister and her diaries, and detailing that in a fun and engaging way for Twitter. So talking about detailed sex scenes and coded orgasms, because Anne Lister, being a 19th century lesbian living in a homophobic society, coded all her very detailed raunchy sex scenes, and much to our enjoyment years later. And so that kind of, it's been kind of interesting. I used to, back in the before lockdown began, do workshops and exhibitions, engaging directly with the kind of physical museum objects. One example was an exhibition I did with Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, directly engaging with their collection, and then welcoming other members of the LGBTQI local community to go into the collection stores and choose their own object to interpret queerly, kind of going beyond what the intent of the original author or creator. Another practice that started a year ago was doing drag. So this is where Eugène de la Croissant comes in. I was telling my dad that I was doing this performance, and he said, "Oh yeah, so you're Pain au Chocolat character," and I was like, "No, it's Eugène de la Croissant." And why Eugène de la Croissant? Because he's a big parody of these kind of white genius artists like Eugène Delacroix, but also a general parody of museum directors and general sense of patriarchy and heteronormativity in the museum sector. And having this character that's completely different from the work I usually do, that marches into different spaces and mansplains essentially about queer and feminist heritage, has been a way for me to say very loudly and very brashly things in a way that's humorous, but that also gets people to think critically about sexism, heteronormativity in our spaces. So one event was Queerly Departed, which Tony D was also part of, with Cemetery Club, where we did an LGBTQ tour of Brompton Cemetery, and Tony did the beautiful spoken word performance, which I'm going to be talking about in a moderated discussion later, because I still think about it every day. It's no lie, it's really incredible. But Eugène, in a slightly kind of less emotionally impactful way, did a lip sync performance of Sisters Are Doing It to Themselves in front of Emmeline Pankhurst's grave, a memorial, sorry, and then put a trans inclusive message on it. So that was great. But the challenge during lockdown is obviously that I'm in my space, prancing around in a mustache and beard, and I don't have a stage anymore. So I've been experimenting a little bit with ideas around doing drag digitally. I do have a video I can show you. I don't know if it's going to work because of the whole kind of nature of technology and how terrifying it is. I don't know if I can, John. It's confusing. I don't know if I can, but in any case, I basically was looking at YouTube and ways different people provide content through YouTube and can try out different formats. And I really got interested in Get Ready With Me videos where people do their makeup and just talk about their day. A few months ago, there was the announcement of that the director of Natural History Museum was going to be the ex-CEO of Amazon. That was quite interesting news for everybody within the museum sector, that to say the least, because this was coming at the same time as lots of discussions around Black Lives Matter and lots of lip service, to be honest, from lots of museums saying that they want to be anti-racist and saying that they hear people and they're here to listen and, you know, to be more inclusive, but then will hire somebody, a man with not many discernible qualifications in terms of directorship and leadership of a museum. So I did a little video that was kind of responding to that and telling you how a little tutorial, a makeup tutorial, how you too can be a museum director. I don't know if I can share it. Oh dear, I don't know if I can share it or not. Maybe I can. It's possible I can. I'm going to try, and somebody's going to have to do a thumbs up to me if it works. Can you see my screen right now? Yes. Okay, great. Okay, right. Well, I'm just going to share, since we're remarkably on time, which is a huge record for any event I've ever hosted. I'm just going to do a video with you, and yeah, and then I'm passing over from me to my very boisterous character, who absolutely wanted to be included as a poor, beleaguered, cis white straight man, Eugène de la Poisson. Let's go. Okay.
Oh yeah. I can do the first one.
Bonjour, I'm Eugène de la Poisson, director of all the museums via 100% entitlement and 0% experience. Welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to show you how to be a real-life museum director. Let's go.
Hi, I'm not able to see it.
Foundation. Maybe you want it to be as thick and long-lasting as the ways in which the history of museums, as the legacies of colonial gentlemen's clubs, displaying looted artifacts from other cultures, have resulted in institutional racism and sexism, which remains pervasive to this day. Unlike this video, many foundation companies do not offer a wide variety of shades. Yes, this matches quite well. Now let's blend it in, which you'll do quite easily. In a museum, it's your white and middle class.
Claire, I don't think we can see the video.
Oh no, okay. Have you just been staring at me this whole time?
I think everyone was being a bit polite.
Oh, okay. Well, you don't have to. I'm French, so I'm very direct each time I can't see something. Can you see it? Can you see it now?
I think it might have been we were seeing the folder, but when you double clicked on it,
oh,
it didn't
okay.
open the window. Yeah.
Right.
You might reshare the window and choose.
All right. Well,
Oh.
you can be as rude as possible. You know, it's okay.
Claire, if you start the video and then share the screen so you can then select that video.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Bonjour, I'm
No.
Eugène de la Poisson.
You can't see it. Okay. Well. Can you see it now?
think you need to, yeah, now we
There you
can
go.
see, yay!
Yay! Okay, I'm going to put it full screen, and you're going to have to yell. I can't see it, Claire. If you can't see it, cool.
Director of all the museums.
Okay.
It's de la Croissance.
Right.
Maybe give us some volume.
Huh? Sorry?
Some volume on the.
Okay, cool. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The issues. Okay, perfect.
It's de la Croissance. Bonjour, I'm Eugène de la Croissance, director of all the museums via 100% entitlement and 0% experience. Welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to show you how to be a real-life museum director. Let's go. Now first, you want a solid foundation. Maybe you want it to be as thick and long-lasting as the ways in which the history of museums, as the legacies of colonial gentlemen's clubs, displaying looted artifacts from other cultures, have resulted in institutional racism and sexism, which remains pervasive to this day. Unlike this video, many foundation companies do not offer a wide variety of shades. Yes, this matches quite well. Now let's blend it in, which you'll do quite easily. In a museum, it's your white and middle class. Now let's add a bit of concealer, concealing how many other people would have been much better qualified for this role than you are. Let's add a bit of definition. Just like we should add new definitions to understand the new role of museums. Not as neutral spaces, but as spaces actively engaged in social and political change, with a duty to reflect that in their programming, their learning, and their staffing. Always go for the jugular. Make a point of it. Next up, you want to add some primer. Now, in this case, a primer in understanding the pervasive ways in which museums exclude people of colour from their staff, let alone upper management, especially when now women, working class, queer, and trans. Now, this is a really important step, your beard and moustache, because if you're expecting to be a director for a major national institution without being a cis white man, well, who are we kidding? We'd better cover up that chin and jawline, but don't worry, you don't need to cover up your lack of qualifications. You'll get hired over more qualified women and people of colour anyway. Next, let's add some colour. Just like your museums will want to add a rainbow flag each June for Pride Month, but then fail to address gender disparity within their collection. Its lack of queer and trans artists, and fail to understand that queerness collection is more than just adding cis white gay men in one exhibition every 5 years. But look, colours, pretty colours. And have queer in your collection is not an excuse for failing to address other issues within your collection, such as racism and colonial violence. Yeah, really have a nice wash of that pink all over your eyelid. Lovely, lovely pink washing. We love it. Eyebrows. Not everything's a metaphor. You just need really good eyebrows. Eyebrows. Really. Privilege. Blushing, because you should be embarrassed. finally, it's time for the lips. Lip service will be really important as part of your role. You need to be able to voice a lot of seemingly sincere expressions of support in terms of enacting change, while simultaneously not changing any of the long-term issues around exclusion and discrimination within the museum sector. And there you have it, how to get yourself hired as a real-life museum director. Shortcut, just be a Smithwick man. Now, a quick PSA. If you're a museum director colleague who feels personally offended by this message, that's good. It shows that you're self-aware, at least self-aware enough to actually use your position of privilege to enact some long-term change within your institution and your wider sector. As such, I greatly look forward to your next steps. De La Croissant out.
Okay, wait. How do I get back to the usual thing? There we go. Right. Oh yeah, awesome. Perfect. Yay, that worked. I'm so happy. Okay, well, after this weird, wonderful intervention by Eugène, if I say so myself, I really enjoyed doing that video, and it was really fun. And I didn't get attacked by any museum directors, which was great. Why don't we have a more general discussion? I think we've got lots of things that we can chat about, and maybe there's specific questions that we've got via YouTube or via Zoom. Otherwise, feel free to add some now, and we can just kick off discussing amongst ourselves to start with our three speakers. So yeah. Thank you so much, all three of you, for your brilliant interventions and introductions of your practice. What really stood out to me was that idea of access and just the amount of labor and effort involved in making these spaces accessible. And that kind of idea of a love-hate relationship, you know, whether it's with the heritage sector, with academia, or the theatre, there's always this idea of having to work extra hard to make these spaces inclusive for a lot more people, and just that sense of exhaustion, which made me think about your work at Tony D with DOSE, and that idea of rest. Your current project with this idea of rest as resistance, and in your work, Hannah, with podcasts and trying to bring out these different subjects that are already approached in academia and in different kind of formats. And Mila, your way of bringing community together with the Queer Heritage Forum, which I'm also a part of, I failed to mention, and which has been a really welcome way of creating community, but also support and kind of creating a safe space for heritage professionals to voice their concerns and worries every 2 weeks since, is it May? I think, no, it's earlier than May. Or is it May?
Got to unmute myself. It's April that it started.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Nice. So yeah, so there we go. There you go. So I'm thinking that we could maybe start that discussion with how you feel about that, how we feel about having to work with these spaces that often don't really give us much back, and maybe how lockdown, how this whole situation has maybe made you consider made you consider different things relating to that, especially now we can't really access museums, we can't really access universities and theatres in the same way. So for you, what has changed and what has remained the same in terms of your goals and your missions?
Sorry, was that for me specifically? Yeah.
Just kind of for everybody.
Do you mind if I go first?
Go for it.
Yeah. So I find that since lockdowns started, I've actually had more energy, more time to do the things that I want to do, because my brain's not like occupied with all the noise of other people and stuff. When you have neurodivergency, you struggle with just sitting in an office with 4 or 5 other people, and that wears you down to the point where you go home exhausted just because there's other people making a lot of noise around you. And I mean, like, you could have had like the easiest day, but those noises and that are constantly wearing you down. And I did not notice how much of an impact it's had on myself until I went into lockdown and worked from home. And suddenly, you know, I'm like making all of this other stuff, I'm doing all these other projects, and I have so much more energy and time.
Yeah. Tony D, Hannah, do you have kind of any things on your end that kind of relate to that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am someone who struggles to have any type of regular job, really. So the arts was inevitable for me. But I think similarly to what Miley was just saying, is that I have sort of found spaces, specifically queer spaces, inaccessible for lots of reasons, whether that being centered on sort of party culture. And I love a rave, but like, you know, there's a limit to how much you want to spend time like sweating with other people. And also just like being in buildings where there may be quite inaccessible to get to, having events, even now, you know, it's important to acknowledge that like we're not in an event that's got BSL provided or captioned, and like I think we should always be critical of the spaces that we provide as well. And like you know, a lot of I go to a lot of Zoom meetings around the arts sector at the moment, and you know, it took maybe 3 months before having a BSL interpreter was like the standard for some of these like really big institutions. You know, these are like national portfolio organizations who are funded a lot of money, and they're hosting events that aren't captioned, that don't have BSL, but don't recognize that having breaks in like, you know, meetings that are going to be over an hour is not a difficult thing to put in, that Zoom fatigue is a really real thing. And I think especially lots of like queer disabled communities have been better at this than the folks who have kind of leaped into having to create digital content without once again excluding those people who couldn't get into their buildings, that couldn't access their events, and it's been really interesting to me to see how long it's taken them to kind of acknowledge that there might be people who need those things in the beginning. You know, like it shouldn't be the last thing on your agenda. If you are prioritizing the well-being of your staff and the people that engage with your content, then you will have access like right at the beginning of that conversation, not 7 points down. So I think, yeah, it's been really interesting to sort of see that, critique that, and then be able to just keep doing better in the spaces that I'm in, and sort of acknowledging constantly that there is better to do. But I also think there's a really big gap in money and funding online content. I shared on Twitter the last tweet that I've just tweeted, if you have Twitter, that's an article about why it's important to fund digital Black queer spaces, and it's a really great interview between someone who runs a meme account, which I'm sure everyone follows their fair share of meme accounts, and if you don't, what are you doing? Get on that. But you know, meme culture is like incredible, and I'm like a big fan of following accounts that are just like utterly ridiculous. I followed one yesterday. It was literally called Ordinary People Memes, and it's just like stock photos of regular people being like, hey, look at the weather, and it just really makes me laugh. It's so ridiculous. But what's really great about that interview, and I think Claire has just shared it, so thank you, is that it talks about how there's this whole culture, like subculture that is on the internet that is full of people who are marginalized, Black folks, trans folks, you know, folks that don't have a voice maybe in traditional queer spaces, and they've like carved out this experience for themselves on digital platforms, but there's no money, and it is like genuine work to run a digital platform. It is, you know, and I don't do it, but I know from friends that run parties and run events that like it is a job to have someone that's like working towards that. There are prototypes that you need to do and testing, and you know, people coming in and trialing out things, and it costs a lot of money. BSL interpreters cost money, and hiring someone to maybe do live captioning costs money, and it's just assumed that because it's the internet, it's free, you know, like everyone can access it, but actually there's a lot of work that goes into that. So I think something that I'm really interested in is how we can start to acknowledge in these big broader conversations about the lack of money there, and who we can start prodding funding wise to be like, there's a whole community of people that would engage with your work or your content or whatever if you were, you know, if you were like pumping money into hosting Instagram parties rather than like your social distance version in your museum. Like, I'm not going to go to that because I'm vulnerable, but I will hop on your Instagram live and watch your event from there. So yeah, I'm really interested in how we can start prodding those people to give us the money that we need to keep these events as accessible as possible.
I think that's such a brilliant point. It's really at the heart of the issue. And also I'm calling myself out because literally as I midway through the video, I was like, this doesn't have captions, it doesn't have subtitles. So if you're not hearing things, so I'm going to re-upload it with subtitles. But it's actually quite a testimony to this idea of privilege, is that if you you can just like post a video just like that spontaneously, and not think about the fact that it's not accessible for lots of people. And I really respond to this idea of labor over the internet. And I think there's been this really toxic idea that of people being asked to create digital alternatives events like it's easy, like it's just kind of something that's completely, completely like, oh yeah, just switch on a webcam and then your event's digital. Or just read out your lesson and now your course is digital. It's like, I don't think that's how it works. And I mean, Hannah, I really relate to what you're saying about podcasting. I've started doing a podcast around queer women with swords, which is a niche content, if any. But it's that idea of podcasts are a really brilliant initiative. You see a lot of them. So there's this kind of almost, on my end at least, naive assumption that you can just sit down, have a conversation with somebody, turn on the microphone, but actually there's just so much, you have to almost relearn a whole form of storytelling. And so I know what your responses and reactions were to that whole process.
Yeah, so the podcasting was it makes me laugh because you assume it's like super easy. I don't know why. I did just assume you sit down and you talk and that's it. You've got a microphone. Oh, isn't that exciting? But literally, my the first one I did was with my brother, and he vapes, and I was going back and editing it, and I was like, I can hear you vaping throughout the whole thing. Please stop. So we're continuing it, and my friend did a podcast the other day, and I'm gonna edit it as soon as everything's sorted. But I was like, do not drink tea, put the mug down while you're talking, please. Just don't do it. I just need you to just sit there and talk. It's just things that you just don't think about. I feel like before any of this happened, I thought I knew how to use computers, right? I thought I knew how to create like digital content. I knew how to do things. And then I realized, actually, no, I don't. Like, we're creating a whole website at the minute because our current website is based with the university and it's just completely inaccessible and it's horrible to build with and do things with. And so we're creating a whole website. It's taking us about 2-3 months, and there's a lot of us on it, and we're doing all this stuff, and it's, you know, to try and learn how to, you know, I didn't go to school for computers, right? I didn't do computer science. I don't know how to do any of this. So I'm looking on the computer like, what the hell is hosting? I don't know what this is. What do you mean hosting a website? So then I was looking for ages, and we eventually figured it out. But, you know, again, I really related to the massive gap in kind of funding online content, because now we're currently trying to get funding, because we lost our funding for the Queer Disrupt, and now we're trying to get more funding. And when I first approached the idea and said, you know, we'd want to do events, but, you know, we wouldn't have to cater them, but there's still bits and pieces, and, you know, we're doing the podcast, and editing software costs money, and to get it out there and do different things, that all costs money. And they were like, oh, surely it's going to be way cheaper. I don't know what money you'll need. And if you haven't done it before, and people don't know how to do it, it's hard to explain. But just the other thing I wanted to say to your point earlier about, you know, like, I don't know, feeling excluded in spaces like academia and spaces like museums and stuff like this, like, I've found during lockdown that it's just so much easier to force space. And maybe that's because I'm not constrained by the physical space and the physical feeling of, you know, I'm just a PhD student, I'm just this, and I'm just trying to get everything else done. Like, I don't feel constrained by that. So now I'm like, oh, I'm going to force space, try and create accessible stuff, try and do different ways of, you know, trying to do stuff. I really rated the museum from home stuff. So when people were doing that hashtag museum from home, and they were, you know, these are little objects that I enjoy, and it felt really personal in a way that I don't feel museums are. So I'm going to be really interested to see if it changes things when everything starts reopening. We'll see what happens. But yeah.
I think that's a really good point about these stories being made more personal, and I think that's the advantage of queering space online, and projects like Queer in Quarantine, which I think we can find via Queer Disrupt. It's the idea of almost creating our own mini museums, museums of our own personal experience. And I think, Miley, you've started the project around this, the Museum of Lost Items. Is it the Museum of Lost Items? Sorry, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, so the game concept is around like the Museum of Lost Things, and we've had to do it on like a shoestring budget. It took us 6 months to do, because surprisingly you need to code to make a game, and I didn't think that I just wrote it out, and I was like, I handed it to my partner, and I was like, you can do this, can't you? You do computers. And he's just like, you kind of need to code for this. And I was just like, you can learn to code, it's fine. We need it in 6 months, you'll be fine. And it's kind of like led into this discussion around like how money, like how it impacts on how much you can do. And like, I have all these ideas, but I don't have the money to do it. So like, and you know, I assume everybody in the art world feels this, is like they have this limited amount of funds in order to create meaningful impacts, and like when you don't have those funds, you just feel like hopeless, basically, in some sense, because you're being stopped. And it's like, basically, if you're not rich, then you can't make art. And it feels like that for a lot of like art applications. Like there was one for Luxembourg, which is like 45 grand or something to win, which is a life-changing amount of money. But you need a hell of a lot of money to be able to, you know, have your artwork displayed there, because I mean, looking back at the past winners, they poured thousands of pounds into their projects, and some people just don't have that cash. Where is the money for those people to facilitate those changes within the community, when you're just like, oh, we don't understand why people of color aren't making art and aren't engaging with us? And like, maybe because you haven't provided them the money to do so, you know.
Yeah, no, exactly. I feel like there's this kind of constant pressure for queer people to kind of put forward, you know, carve out their space. But sometimes when you just don't have the money to do so, and you don't have the opportunity to be given a platform to do so, then that's not going to happen. I think back to that Queerly Departed event that took place within Brompton Cemetery. cemetery full of essentially dead, lots of in terms of the historical figures, lots of dead white Victorians, which is a choice. But what I really liked from Tony D's spoken word intervention within Queerly Departed was saying, let's forget the people who are here, who are dead, who are in the ground, they're already here. Let's look at the people who are not here, but also whose voices are not being told, are not being showcased. What I find quite frustrating, I think, and what I'm quite a bit concerned about in terms of the kind of pitfalls of lockdown and restriction of budget, is this idea that lots of museums have been experimenting with more radical ways of enacting queerness and doing so in an intersectional way. And are we at the danger of returning to this idea of the blockbuster exhibition with all your famous male queer artists, David Hockney and the like, in a way that is going to ignore voices that still need to be heard, and we can't really keep relying on people's constant work to do so, because then it ends up being a cycle of exhaustion. And there's many stories within heritage and that we tell ourselves and that we share behind locked doors of people who have been physically exhausted by the sectors that they're trying to change. We were discussing with Hannah, who led the previous July meetup session, about this idea of do you have to reclaim a space, or sometimes you just need to destroy it? Do you need to completely destruct it and burn it to the ground? Metaphorically speaking, of course, we're not, I'll let you express your own opinion about that, Tony. I'm just covering my own ass legally. Do we actually need to completely break out these spaces and kind of create our own micro spaces, our own micro museums and micro narratives, and kind of take back the collection? For me, being able to engage with collections digitally, non-physically, have actually been easier, because I can literally take things, juxtapose them with other queer icons, just kind of actually Photoshop them, draw them in a way that's not really possible to engage with the actual physical museum object. So I don't know how you feel about that. And we're still asking for questions, by the way. So if you have a question you want to ask in the chat box below, go for it. I don't know if anybody wants to react to that.
I think that's part of the reason why I made the games with like Museum of Lost Things. The concept was that, anything that you've lost is in that museum, regardless of how much you feel like it should be there. We're gonna put it there. Like there's gonna be there's potentially a wall of somebody's car keys or something like that, or lost childhood toys, and then I put a question out on Twitter where they were just what would you find in that museum? And everybody came back with conceptual questions like, oh yes, I've lost my childhood, or I've lost my virginity. And I'm just like, how am I going to make a wall of virginity in a museum? And I love the idea that a museum can be wholly digital and accessible to anybody with an iPhone or an iPad or whatever. And you have the Museum of Broken Relationships and the Museum of Happiness as well, that have just started up recently, which are sector changing, I feel, in terms of how they access the spaces and how they re-quantify what a museum is.
Yeah, definitely. It's just incredible how as well museums have started via the internet as well. Thinking about the Vagina Museum, which is this really incredible completely queer inclusive and trans inclusive museum devoted to the gynecological anatomy. Hopefully nobody from the Vagina Museum shoots me down for that pronunciation. And then have established themselves as a brick and mortar museum, but have still kept that sense of the internet language and being able to kind of exchange with people online, have that idea of kind of meme-like idea of being kind of a meme. It's funny to talk about vaginas, and it's kind of liberating, but also touching on important subjects. And I think that's really, really interesting in itself. Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of refer back to what you were saying about, I mean, I don't work in the museum or heritage sector, but I think like if things were more digital, you probably could give people their things back. Just gonna put that out there, that like, you know, you could probably return the items to the countries that they belong in, and everyone could look at them from the country that they belong in. But you know, maybe that's totally unreasonable in the British colonial context. But I also was thinking a little bit about you said something, Claire, about this sort of art becoming who's left behind after this pandemic, and who will be available to access things, and who will be leading things, who, you know, and I've been having this conversation a lot in the theatre world, because such a big percentage of theatre workers are freelancers, and they've been so unprotected by the state, given the current pandemic situation, and loads of my friends have left the industry and probably won't return, because why would you return to a sector that is so badly paid and for, you know, overworks you, and then you know, economists saying that we are low skilled workers, but you listen to podcasts every day and watch television and listen to music. So I find it very ironic that the first thing Boris Johnson said he was going to do after lockdown was go to the theatre, but there'll be no actors for you, Boris, because all of them will be working in Starbucks, which is a tragedy. But all of these people, it reminded me of when there was the statue in Bristol was torn down and thrown into the water, rightly so, and the response to that was a white artist who is already quite established, creating a statue and working with the Black woman that he did the image of, and putting that in place of temporary, but it isn't there anymore, but it was a temporary piece of work. And he didn't have to do that. He could have given that work to someone else who was more appropriate to make that work, and to respond in a way that felt like it was from the community. And it reminds me, it feels like a really good metaphor for what's probably going to happen. There'll be lots of cis white men who will create work and be trying to talk on behalf of for the next 5 years, because all of those voices that were being slowly built up in theatres and cultural places, that they will have disappeared. You know, there are venues who have maybe 30% staff that are you know, people of colour, and as soon as the business consultants come in to save these brick and mortar places, it's always, you know, they cut their low wage staff, and the low wage staff are always the people of colour, they're always the disabled folks, and they're the people that earn the least money in that organisation, and those organisations don't represent the communities that they're meant to, and I worry that there will be lots of that sort of, I'm going to make a stand about something, I want to make a point about something, and just like missing the mark completely, and these people taking up space that they don't need to, and actually handing the platform over to someone else is a much more appropriate way of standing in solidarity or making a point. And I think I was part of a residency recently with a company called Two Destination Language, a theatre company, and I did a talk on anti-capitalist and anti-racist practice, and the sort of question that I posed to everyone in the residency is, what are you willing to lose? And I think I would pose that to everyone who thinks that they are radical in the way that they exist. And I would always propose that, like, what are you willing to give up to make sure that this is a more equitable space? And for lots of folks, that's an uncomfortable question, because it would mean giving up all of their privilege or some of their privilege, some of their capital, whether that's social capital or financial. Yeah, so on that, I'm going to be quiet now, but I would always pose that question: what are you willing to lose when you think that you're doing something radical?
I think that's amazing. I think that's a really, really good question just to have always constantly at the back of your mind. And I really kind of I understand strongly what you mean. Is this idea also of that difference between representation and actually who's actually being staffed, who's actually on the payroll to enact that change, because you can have all the kind of exhibitions about trans and queer people of color you want in the world at big institutions, but if the staff is still white, then it's not going to make a damn difference. There's been a recent initiative on Twitter, which I will share, called No More Wannells, which I just love the name Wannells. But it's basically saying if you're a white person and you're being invited to speak on a panel, immediately ask who else is on the panel, and if it's a panel that's full of other white people, just learn how to say no, how to say, I don't want to be on this panel. There are lots of other people of color in the field. Invite somebody else, or I don't want to be included unless this panel is actually an accurate representation of the sect of my sector, and non-overrepresentation of white, cis, straight, middle-class people. So thank you so much for that question. And I think it's a really good one that we can bring into the larger kind of breakout discussions afterwards. In the meantime, I'm just going to ask if there's anybody who has a question, if there's questions from YouTube or from Zoom. Thank you so much, Victoria, in the chat for sharing your research. Called Work in Progress. Thank you. Sally, Daniela, do you have any questions from Zoom or YouTube for us?
We haven't actually got any questions at all. YouTube time, but
yeah, lots of people sharing.
Jumping into the Zoom chat, so I think Daniela's going to pick that up.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I think it's a nice reversal in a way of rather than us being asked questions, as Tony D asking a really, really good question in terms of like, what are you willing to lose? Yeah, and I think, yeah, for me, it's I'm going to try and do this exercise and ask my own question: is which bridges are you willing to burn? Because I've had this discussion a lot with lots of fellow curators who have had sometimes bad experiences with some institutions that have not treated them correctly, but being scared of speaking out or calling out that behavior for fear of burning a bridge, of not being invited back. But then you kind of wonder, if you're engaged with this place that has been systemically not treating its employees correctly and has not been engaging in anti-racist behavior, and not understanding intersectionality, should you want to continue working with them? And I think that if we're able to kind of flip the narrative on those places and just kind of question who we're willing to work with as a kind of more of a two-way street, then maybe we'll be able to make a bit more progress in terms of queering institutions online and offline. Oops. We've been streaming for a while now, I've just realized. So I'm going to leave that as my parting question as we kind of maybe wrap up our live, and we're going to move on to more of a kind of breakout rooms discussion. So yeah, thank you very much for people who watching on YouTube, and there we go.